Mr. Hitchcock, before we get down to serious business, I'd like first of all to very personally thank you for 40 years for me of marvelous movie-going. It's been a great pleasure seeing them and meeting you today. Most of the interviews I've seen and read with you have tended, I think, perhaps understandably, to concentrate on the bigger films, the later films, the Spellbound, the Rear Windows, and so on. And today, with your permission, I'd like to, initially at least, go back to the beginning and discuss some of the earlier films which may not be quite so familiar today, particularly since you worked in the German silent film. Yes. To ask you how much your early English films, particularly films like Number 17, really drew on the pictorial style that you may have picked up in the German cinemas and German studios.
Well, in those days, this would be about 1924, when the UFA studios were at their zenith almost. Mm-hmm. They emerged from a company called Dekla Bioskop, and in those days I used to write the script and then become the art director. And I wasn't directing then, but I went to work at Neubabelsberg, and of course they were making some of the most famous films, the German films, the Nibelungen and Jannings, The Last Laugh. Jannings was a tremendously important figure, as was Murnau, the director, Lang, Lubitsch, in those days. And I remember when I was working there, our picture was called The Blackguard, but they were making The Last Laugh. And in those days, it's just the opposite to what happens today. Everything was done on the lot. And it didn't matter what the set was, they'd build it. And I remember in The Last Laugh, Jannings, it was a story about the reverence that the Germans have for the uniform. And it's the only film ever made that told the story purely pictorially, without titles, without a word. Of course, it was silent films in those days anyway. And they even built a hotel with the lobby and all the streets outside, with all the traffic and everything. And they even built a railroad station with the great big glass roof and the locomotive and the passengers moving backwards and forwards. And they were, to me, prodigious jobs of production.
Yes. Of course, the late British silence and the early British talkies were pretty much dominated by borrowed German talent, cameramen, directors, and so on. And I think a film like your own Number 17 is very, very German in its pictorial style. Do you remember that film?
Yes, but more than that, I think The Lodger, which was the third film. The first two films I made as a director were made in Munich, and I had to direct them in German. But of course, they were English stories played with German actors, character people, but it made no difference because there was no sound, just titles. When I got back to England to do Number 3 film, it was Mrs. Belloc Lowndes' famous book, The Lodger. And this is the story of a rooming house in London where she wondered and the rest of the family wondered whether the man upstairs is Jack the Ripper or not.
At one of your other early British films lately, the 1934 Man Who Knew Too Much, which I love because of the way it gets into the basic plot and the initial murder so very quickly and so very simply. You seem a little unhappy with the film. You refer to it as the work of a talented amateur, whereas your later film you consider that of a professional. I'm just wondering where you put the distinction, where you feel you stopped being an amateur and became that professional.
I think actually the difference would be that in the original Man Who Knew Too Much, I wasn't audience conscious, whereas in the second one I was.
But I must admit, many of us still feel that those early British films are by no means the work of an amateur, but represented in some way some of your best work.
The best thing, and I can't remember to this day, I think it was to involve the father more. You see, having had Stewart in the role, you had to change your story because in the original, Leslie Banks, the English actor, was in the lead, and he was caught and spent the end of the film locked up in a room. Well, you couldn't do that with a man of the stature of James Stewart. So your story had to be manipulated to give him more activity in the latter part.
Yes.
And in such a way, I lost the original story's climax, which was the famous Sydney Street Siege, which was a time about 1910 when 3 anarchists held up the whole of the British police force, the soldiers from the Tower of London, and just 3 of them. That's when Churchill went down. And there are photographs of him directing operations from a doorway. And these men held everyone up, and they were about to send to the nearest arsenal at Woolwich for the artillery to come out. It was, when I went to Scotland Yard researching for the second version, a rather officious public relations man answered me in an extremely peremptory way. I said, well, how would you handle the Sydney Street Siege today? Oh, he said, we just sent 2 men in with a dog.
Well, they wouldn't have anarchists today anyway in England.
Well, they have a different kind of anarchist.
One other point I wanted to get into was the technique you've developed and, I'd say, exploited through the years, sort of reaching past your actors and literally directing the audience so that you get the emotions you want, not by the players on screen, but by the by the people sitting in the audience, which of course is what any good director should do. But of course, you've made rather a specialty of it.
Well, the audience, that's what it's all about.
Yes, but when did you sort of become conscious of the fact that this was the way you would really specialize in directing?
I think during my American period, I became very conscious of audience. And
although there are hints in the beginning, because the close-up example of the glass of drugged wine in The Lady Vanishes is a very good example of directing the audience to that and not to the players.
That is true. Well, you see, that comes under the heading of avoiding the cliché. You see, the poisoned wine situation, or the drugged wine, the character usually picks it up and goes like that and says, oh, by the way, and you said this, and he does this about a half a dozen times, which is such a cliché. So I decided to avoid that cliché and merely leave the wine there untouched until the last minute. But in order to keep the audience reminded of it, I photographed the scene, part of the scene, through the 2 glasses. So that will keep the audience saying, well, when are they going to pick up the drugged wine?
I've heard you say in the past that, which is surprising for a director who makes so many thrillers and suspense films, that you don't basically like the device of the chase as part of your films. Is that because you are sort of limited to being on location, that you can't pre-plan that on the storyboard?
No, I think the chase is very good. But I've never gone in for the purely physical chase. I know it's very effective, and you've had it in many, many films. I think where I've changed is the chase to rescue someone. That I've never cross-cut. You see, in the early Griffith days, you know, he used to cross-cut with the man either going to the gallows or the guillotine with the rescuer on the way. Well, I've tended to avoid that kind of cross-cutting in a chase sequence and stayed either with one or the other, which makes the audience sweat the more, because you don't show the progress of the rescuer. Now, in The Birds, I did that once or twice.